I think a country's wealth is its food production. So if you don't have quality food production and people are not around, they've abandoned the cities, population migration again. And it's so interesting now that the whole thing worldwide for the last 3 or 4 years has been about population migration. And the economy we see right now is starting to contract. Well, it does every time because asset values don't hold. You have to base an asset value on something that is stable. Well, if people are not working because they're hungry, they're malnourished, or supply chains have broken down, there's no way to have a stable asset class any longer. It has to be revalued as it is every cycle. And at the same time, as the sun steps down in its output, the magnetic field on our planet changes. And this also has an effect on the human perception of what is reality around them. And you notice every one of these cycles that there is a change in governance, global governance, structured governance of the citizenry. We're back at it again.
All right, welcome back to the Hrvoje Morić Show on TNTRadio.live. I've got a great guest today, David Dubine, who I have been listening to for years, together with folks like the Ice Age Farmer, who I've interviewed in the past. They provide thought-provoking analysis. David is the creator of the Adapt 2030 channel on YouTube, discussing energetic changes on Earth as the sun repeats its 400-year cycle of low activity, affecting global crop production, the economy, and everyone on our planet, with a timeline for what you can expect from now to 2030 and beyond as society resets. Welcome to TNT Radio, David.
Hrvoje, thanks for having me on. I've been waiting to talk to you. So many important things that affect everybody who eats on this planet will enjoy listening to us talk today.
Most definitely. And I think most people like to eat. So before we get into it, could you just give us a quick, for the people that don't know about you and your work, if you could give us just a quick background on yourself and your work?
Yeah, I used to be a coffee buyer in Myanmar, and it's a country known as Burma, for those of you that understand the older name of the country. And when I was working there, this is back in 2012, 2011, just when it was opening up, because there were so many sanctions on it. And, I was working in Asia anyway, and suddenly this place opened up. I couldn't believe it that we got invited down there to look at coffee and started exporting inter-Asia. But, one thing when we were there talking to the coffee farmers, they were explaining that the bean density was a little bit different because they were getting freezes. And they said, oh, don't worry about that. Our grandparents and great-grandfathers, when they were setting up coffee plantations, when the British were trying to turn it into a cash crop in the mid to late 1880s, experienced the same thing. So don't worry about it. It'll pass. But the density right now, when the beans freeze, they leave these little tiny micro pockets in there. And the bean density for your roaster, because we would buy the green beans, well, your roaster is going to have to take that into consideration when they do the roasting or what they want to do with the flavor blends and the profiles. And I thought that was kind of strange because I only ever knew global warming at that point. So then I quickly started to look for different cycles. We were interested in continuing the business. So what can we get from now through the next 5 years? If cold was going to be an issue and they were getting cold leaf damage, top leaf freeze damage, I wanted to understand this process. So I started looking for cycles from the 1880s, really what was driving this. Like, was it going to be a 2-year cycle of cold, 5-year, whatever? I didn't know. I went in completely blind. I didn't know what to expect. So then doing the research, I suddenly found out, wow, there's these much larger cycles that come through on 400-year cycles. And then at the same time, when you compare that to the collapse of what was the considered civilizations or society or restructuring of monetary systems, economic collapse, population migration, and the way governments had turned to still rule the citizens, trying to regain control during tumultuous famine times, they matched right up with the solar activity. And I thought, wait, I need to talk to more people.
You have a choice. in today's unstable world. Eat Z-Bugs or plan ahead. Eat Z-Bugs or buy the storable foods. Investing time and thought into creating your emergency food supply is a proactive step towards safeguarding your well-being and your family. With the right food supplies, you can maintain your physical and mental well-being and face any unforeseen event with resilience and strength. HeavensHarvest.com. Use promo code ADAPT and save 15% at checkout. Don't be forced to eat Z-Bugs.
And now on with the video. And then I did, and I really started to get out there and talk with John Casey and quite a few others as I moved through that arena of trying to study and understand solar activity and how it pertained to food production and specifically coffee production. And I tell you what, I have not come back from that. This is why I do what I do full time now, because I believe this is the most important thing of our lifetimes that nobody's talking about except deflections and narrative to give you excuses why everything is in disarray right now. But if you look at it in the longer term, it's just a cycle repeating in history that we're witnessing again, and we're at the onset period of this cycle.
Yeah, I kind of fell down that similar rabbit hole, but of course you've taken it to amazing levels with the work that you do. In the past, I've interviewed a number of times Lord Christopher Monckton. I taught a course here at University in Mexico on environment and international relations. And I would try to get across to students. It was so hard because 99% of the students bought into the official narrative, and it was really hard to talk to them about it. But I do feel that more and more people are realizing the fraud of the official narrative regarding climate change and its agenda, but still are not aware of the reality of, I'll call it global cooling. And hopefully you'll give us sort of a crash course on this situation, as well as, getting your thoughts on how this is going to play out, the global economy, supply chains breaking down, inflation, collapse, food shortages, and so on. And, we've got elites attempting to put us into a technological and dystopian control grid, the Great Reset, top that off with war, of course, what's going on in Ukraine. And of course, getting to talking about solutions and how people can prepare for the hard times and hard road ahead. One of my starting points, I thought, would be perhaps to get your take on this idea and theory of man-made or anthropogenic global warming, otherwise known as climate change today. And, why do you think they've been trying to sell us on this since, well, in the 1970s, it was global cooling, and then they flipped to global warming, and now it's climate change, basically the weather, climate catastrophe. What's your take on this?
Well, the same thing that you've experienced is once you find an expert that has true data that can be argued in a debate stage, you'll find the global warming purveyors will never get on a stage face-to-face, fact-to-fact with that, because you can't. And every time you ask somebody to come on to debate you on such a fact, they're like, no, we don't want to be seen. We'll be associated with you deniers over there. The governments of the world had an A or B choice as it looks in hindsight right now. This 400-year cycle could be in itself the intensity of this once in a 400-year event, or it could be a heavier, more powerful cycle. And that's what Piers Corbyn believes. And I've had some chance face-to-face time with him in the UK. Again, John Casey, who else is out there? Dr. Abudzhamatov from the Pulkovo Observatory, Valentina Zarkova, who I'm going to say under threat had to retract her mathematical models of double dynamo canceling magnetic waves in the sun due to the precision that would cause a global panic. And once you start to see this true information, you understand that it's a cycle. Now, if you know the onset of the cycle and the dates of the cycle onset, two things happen. First, you're going to know that the changes would occur and then what those changes would be during past cycles. So for myself, I've studied back to, say, 2,400 years prior, 400 BC. There's pretty good records of how society was upset. And I call it the fingerprint of the grand solar minimum, because the same three things always happen every single time. If you want to boil it down to its rudimentary form, three things always happen. And I just mentioned those. The economy collapses because the value is based on work or based on production of something. And specifically, I think a country's wealth is its food production. So if you don't have quality food production and people are not around, they've abandoned the cities, population migration again. And it's so interesting now that the whole thing worldwide for the last 3 or 4 years has been about population migration. And I can't really believe that this is just a random happenstance. And the economy we see right now is starting to contract. Well, it does every time because asset values don't hold. You have to base an asset value on something that is stable. Well, if people are not working because they're hungry, they're malnourished, or supply chains have broken down, there's no way to have a stable asset class any longer. It has to be revalued as it is every cycle. And at the same time, as the sun steps down in its output, the magnetic field on our planet changes. And this also has an effect on the human perception of what is reality around them. So I found through history that during these times of incredibly low solar activity, famines take place, economies reset, but then governments in tandem try to march lockstep with the electromagnetic effects. It seems the governance structure of the way that we, the humans, are ruled on this planet seems to change as I guess awareness would be the best way to put it. And you notice every one of these cycles that there is a change in governance, global governance, structured governance of the citizenry. We're back at it again. You know when it's going to onset. You know how humans are going to behave, because I think we spent billions and billions of dollars of psychological studies. So you know how the human populace will respond to stimulus. And what are we seeing right now is global warming was choice. You could tell the populace, you know what, we're coming into either a 400-year or a 2,000-year intensity cycle that is going to disrupt food production. It's going to disrupt the economy, governance. It's going to be crime on the streets. There's going to be famine. But please keep going to work and investing in your 401k. Or you could say, hey, there's global warming here, to explain away everything that we are seeing now, and it will intensify through the next few years, and have an excuse already built into what the changes would happen. How many years have you and I both seen global warming shoved down our throats? 30 years? Well, they were getting you ready 30 years in advance to see what we are seeing today. The changes are so stark, there's nowhere to run. Nobody's not seeing changes. And as this electromagnetic field continues to move, they call it polar wander, we're going to see jet streams go out of flow even further, and we're going to see cloud cells collapse in on themselves. And that's why we get these record rains and why there's droughts in some areas, because the cloud cells are literally moving with the jet streams to different locations on the planet. This is well-established science. Tens of thousands of research papers on this. Intertropical convergent zone moving north or south based on solar activity and how intense the magnetosphere, or our electromagnetic field on the planet, is locking those systems in place, the weather systems, the jet streams, and cloud cells. And when it gets loose, so does the weather systems across the planet. I'll leave it there. I think I talked too long. Excuse me, or I just ramble sometimes.
There are no rules here, uncensored, unfiltered. And that's one thing people like about me as a host, that I let my guests, my experts speak at length, because that's who they really want to hear. And I thought I'd just comment. I'm lucky. I just realized my governor in the state that I live in Mexico, Jalisco, is apparently the number one state in terms of agricultural production in Mexico. So at least I've got that going for me. And you mentioned Piers Corbin. When I was teaching that course on environment and IR like a decade ago here at Mexico's top university, I purchased one of Piers's forecasts. I forget the name of his website, weather, climate. People can look it up. But I bought it like in January or February. And he literally, because he bases his forecasts on the sun and the solar cycle and the moon. And to the day, he said in his January forecast that I purchased, or February, like he literally said March 25th. I've still got a copy of it somewhere. March 25th, you would see like flooding in Midwest America and all of this stuff. And I kid you not, to the day I was looking at NBC News, they were saying like historic floods in Iowa and all of this stuff exactly as he was able to predict. And I told my class, like, if you have a hypothesis and it's proven true, like Piers's hypothesis that it's, as you're saying, the solar cycle that's running everything, then this must be right. And the other theory must be wrong. How long do you think this period of low solar activity is going to last?
Well, you're wrong for even bringing it up and going against the narrative. I'm not going to tell you. That's the kind of response you get all the time. And I'm just shocked because I'm curious. Can I ask you, Orve, when you were talking to Lord Monckton, like after you really had understood that research and you tried to present it to other people, what kind of blowback did you get for trying to explain the truths that you'd seen on, cycles in history overlapping with solar activity and all of this being more of a solar driven thing that you can't tax? And like, what was the response from either students you'd talked to or other faculty there after you'd spoken with them about a different set of information than the programming allowed?
Oh, it's eye rolling, conspiracy theorists. You're the conspiracy professor on campus. I actually had a course. I taught both at the high school and the university. And the reason I chose high school is because you see this across the board around the world. It's much easier to lose your job as a professor at a university than it is at the high school. So the high school was kind of like my foundation. And I got my courses taken away at some point for like 1 or 2 semesters. So that was the response collectively. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's so startling is the main driver of everything we're seeing take place right now. If your eyes are even half open, every event you're seeing on the planet is based on this solar cycle and this solar activity. Because another thing that's a little bit too coincidental is Ukraine is the largest breadbasket of Europe, and Kazakhstan is also the largest breadbasket if you're heading a little bit more into the Central Caucasus and further into the edges of Asia. So I'm looking at these two things in Eurasia going, wait a second, both of these breadbaskets, the largest places to produce the most food in regional areas in Eurasia and then also in Europe itself, are under duress right now. I mean, this is a fight for food growing areas more than anything else. And when you start to look at the news that you're seeing from a different perspective of just, what you're seeing as the narrative on the news, Russia bad, Ukraine good, whatever. Can't believe those people in Kazakhstan wouldn't accept central banking. Can't they just take the money and be happy and be quiet? I mean, we're going to give them extra money. People aren't going to play that game when they realize their food's taken away. But if you look at the news in a different fashion and you start to look at it through a different lens of what food transportation, what food storage, what food processing facilities are in those nations or in that city, and that's the first thing you would do research on, then it starts to take a whole different brushstroke on what we're seeing out in the news right now. And that's what people really need to focus on is the production of food. And you can't tell me this many people are fighting for this exact same land that is the largest food producers in 2 different regions of the Northern Hemisphere. It can't be that much of a coincidence. Truly, it can't.
Because I think climate engineering as well is related to the things we're talking about. I interviewed 10 years ago, the late Michael J. Murphy, who produced What in the World Are They Spraying, which is a fascinating documentary, which was financed by G. Edward Griffin, who I've also had the pleasure of meeting in person. By the way, David, you mentioned Kazakhstan. I lived in Kazakhstan from 2017 to 2020. And for the longest time, I've been forecasting a color revolution, an attempt to overthrow the Kazakh government, which everyone saw what happened in January. I even had the Kazakh intelligence interested in me. I think they were wondering, how does this guy know about these things? But anyways, talking about COVID 1984 and the Great Reset, all this stuff that's happening now, governments all around the world are trying to put in these totalitarian control systems. Do you think these elites, as you said, they were planning for this decades ago, 30 years ago? Do you think that they've pushed, COVID and global warming and this Great Reset kind of as cover stories to cover the real behind the scenes reasons for our problems, which are, more related to the cooling cycle and the energy issues?
It would be a blend of both. So I will say that anybody listening, that we're going to be going to digital rationing cards. How are they going to get you there? Well, they couldn't get you to the digital ID for the COVID because many people did not take the vaccine. People didn't want to get on the facial recognition apps to do such a thing. But if everybody's hungry and starving, that's going to be a large percentage of the planet that will do that to get their digital rationing card. Because even if you didn't have the vaccine, okay, they couldn't force you to get onto that system. But if they take away your food supply, and if it exists all across all nations and all supermarkets that you need to have a digital rationing card to enter that, to then purchase the items, which brings me back to COVID. What did COVID do? It wiped out nearly all small business across the planet. So really the only players left to sell food are corporate entities. And if the corporate entities are marching lockstep, which we see that they do quite a bit across the planet, then everybody that's in the corporate world could say, yes, we will follow. And yes, you have to have a digital rationing card to buy anything in our wares, in our markets, supermarkets. All the small businesses, I'm not going to say all, but I'm going to say a very, very, very large percent was wiped out during COVID. And at the same time, they were using that for training. Stand 6 feet apart. Only so many of you in the supermarket or into the store at any one time. They've already gotten you used to standing out in front of a supermarket, looking through the glass at the food, saying, oh, I'm next in line, 6 feet. Okay, only 20 people in the whole store. That's it, only allowed. But I am going to take it a step further and say that the word flash mobs has been now injected into our consciousness. And flash mobs will start hitting the supermarkets. At the same time, that gives them leeway to station troops and police in the supermarkets. So you're going to see military across any city that you go to in a food selling, corporate controlled environment. And you'll have to present your digital rationing card. And then, this flash mob thing could also be used out in the countryside where, oh, a flash mob hit a grain storage facility. Oh, a flash mob hit a warehousing facility that was stocking food for distribution into, a multitude of cities. And now see in the cities, they don't have the food because the flash mobs hit the storage facilities. We need to put troops in the farms. Flash mobs are stealing cows out of the fields. Flash mobs are stealing the goats out of the fields. Flash mobs are running and stealing all the fruit out of a whole orchard. They're stealing all the corn. They're doing everything. Flash mob, flash mob. Watch it happen. Just as you called Kazakhstan, I am saying the same thing unequivocally. By the end of this year, flash mob will be related to having troops and police anywhere food is grown, just insert it in there along with your digital card.
A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. That's why we must steer our own future. For the last 10,000 years at least, gold has rarely suffered from economic and political crises, as it has always been a stable. Gold is perceived as a symbol of wealth, power, and majesty. Gold has had an exalted position throughout the ages as a highly coveted, even worshipped material. That's why most every major civilization has collected and saved gold. Gold has maintained its worth and usefulness as currency throughout time and will continue to do so. Gold has an important economic role as a means of exchange should currency collapse, insurance that will protect you and your families against financial turmoil of any kind. ITM Trading is a precious metals company that has been in business for over 27 plus years, with a mission to educate and empower individuals to hedge against inflation, mitigate financial risk, and prepare for the Great Reset. Schedule your free gold and silver strategy call, 866-834-1422, 866-834-1422.
So I think it is to its end, but if you want to go into Soviet history here, the Holodomor, where up to, they say 10 or 12 million people were starved to death, they took away all the farming implements. They took away all the farm machines, all the seeds, everything, and they just cordoned the area off, and people were left with their bare hands to try to grow food, and they burned all the buildings and all the homes on the way out. The Soviets, or Russia, if you, whatever term I'm still sticking between 1930s and now to try to draw the parallel. The same thing. The Ukrainian farmers at the time were growing wheat, and during this mechanization phase, were able to grow, literally 5, 8, 10 times the amount of wheat that was anything possible in the 1920s. So they had all the machinery, and they were in a huge breadbasket. So they started to grow an enormous amount of grains and exporting it out right through all these ports we're hearing about again and again. It's just a recycle in history. They became so powerful, so wealthy, but the rest of what was Russia at the time was still rather poor. So the Bolsheviks, and you've heard about the Bolshevik Revolution, had started to blame all of the farmers being so wealthy and not giving away the grain for free to the rest of the citizens, that it was their fault that they were hungry. So they started to blame everybody in Ukraine. So they went in and just started cordoning off and stealing all the farm machinery, no seed in, all the food gone. And we're seeing like a 2.0 here. I'm really shocked at the similarities. This area here, these pictures coming out of Melitopol, a little bit different than Mariupol, not to confuse the two. But this is southeastern Ukraine. If you look at USDA crop growing maps, then you'll see exactly where they're talking about in the southeast quadrants. They're starting to say that there's going to be a deficit of 20% of the world's wheat will not be grown this year because of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. But I'm saying, whoa, that's minimal. That is a narrative you're following. That's the distraction. What the really elephant in the room not looking at is the fertilizer shortages and the herbicide shortages, which are going to cut the knees out of global agriculture. And they're making you look over at Ukraine, and that is going to be the smallest of the losses. They were looking, in my research, along with so many others, and these forecasts were before Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, you answered one of my questions. Today, my governor here in Mexico only today has officially removed the mask mandates. And of course, I'm still suspicious. I'm like, they're going to be bringing this stuff back. And I was going to ask you, do you think they'll bring back the biosecurity states? And you kind of answered it in October, in the fall, the food rationing card. So it's basically the same thing, just with a different flavor, right? Slightly different flavor. So this stuff will be back, just in a different form. And you, just to touch on what you mentioned earlier about them, the flash mobs, even going to rural areas, I was going to ask you, there are rumors now that Australia, I don't like to share this news unless I find the actual document, but Ice Age Farmer and yourself and many others have been reporting on these things for years, how they're trying to restrict the growing of food, personally in your own home. Do you feel going forward, governments will go down this path of making it legally more and more difficult to grow your own food? So, what do you do on your own homestead, your own rural independent plot of land? I mean, as you said, if they go out to the rural areas with troops, I mean, I guess you've got no other option. They're going to take your food from you or what?
Right. Have no other option. And then what? See, please understand that. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to take away your food, your farm implements. They're going to take away your machinery in any way for you to produce more food. So that is what you're facing. Now, you need to make that stark realization and that choice on the second when they come to your door or you see them coming through your field. You really are going to make a choice that you're never coming back from. You need to make that choice right then on what you want to do. That's everybody's personal choice, but you are going to starve if they come and take your food away. And, I've been looking at that same article, and I try to not say anything unless I can have a source with it and then give you the link so you can do your own research. Because I believe, don't really listen to me, listen to what I have to say, but then I'll provide you with some links and resources, and it's up to you to do your own research on this. That's what I don't like, is everybody's trying to ram it down everybody's throat. But I'm like, here's what I'm saying, and here's all the resources I use, and this is what I have to present. Now take it from there and run with it. Do your own research. I never want to say, don't listen. Oh, you can't listen. You can't even look at that research. Don't look at it. And that's generally what a lot of these governments are saying, especially when you present ulterior or different information in the narrative. It's like, no, you can't even look over there. I'm the 100% opposite. Please look with a microscope at every possibility. What happens if you cannot grow your own food? I'm still trying to dig further into that story. I've seen it come across, and I'm perplexed by it as well. How can you stop people from growing food and then come and tear up their gardens if they are growing food? Like, what kind of repercussions? That would not fly here for sure. And where I live a 23-acre farm out in East Tennessee, way, way far away, up near the Cherokee National Forest. It's about 4 miles from here. If they were to come out here and do that, they're definitely going to have some family members that'll be real sad at the end of the day. How can they get away with that in Australia without people going, all right, that is the very last straw? You can push people to an edge. And looking back at this Holmidor, I just am so baffled that all those people, once the first, areas got starved out or all their equipment was stolen, that somehow, I know communications weren't the best back then, but that somehow word didn't travel. Hey, when the Bolsheviks come in, they're going to steal all your stuff and they're going to burn your houses on the way out. So you might want to put up some resistance at that point because they are going to kill you and starve you. The word Holmidor is terror famine. Once you translate it from Ukrainian into English, it's terror famine. That's what it is. And that's what was put onto the people. And, what's happening in Australia is something very similar. But word is hopefully traveling faster than it did in the 1930s. But at what point do people finally put their foot down and say, no, this stops now. We make it stop.
And I wanted to get back to the fertilizer. I've had a couple of guests I've talked to. Nathan Carson has been a guest on TNT as well as my podcast. He works, I think, in Florida in the fertilizer food supply. He's head of supply chains or whatever. But he was basically saying that we're going to start seeing famine now that will hit the third world hard. He was saying in the developed world, we're still going to have food. Things will become more expensive, but it won't be as bad in the developed world. And we are starting to see unrest now. Sri Lanka, protests. Spain, there were protests not long ago. Greece, here in Mexico, I've been reading the tortilla price is skyrocketing. Corn production is going to decline 20% for various reasons, I think, related to fertilizer. And the recent video, you said they've been trying to hide the declining crop yields around the world. So if you could tell us more about how you see the whole issue surrounding the fertilizer shortages. I mean, is it deliberate or just an unintentional consequence? Why aren't they planting in Ukraine? That's kind of strange. And, tell us more about this. And is it going to be something that lasts, for years or like a decade? What are your thoughts?
Yes, the fertilizer shortages seem to be a planned thing in coordination with railroads stopping deliveries or stopping the ability to take on excess capacity for deliveries. And you look at fertilizer prices have tripled or quadrupled, and some of the base inputs are not available anymore. So for me, I look at it in just a rational sense here. And before all the Ukraine and the Russia debacle had started, CF Industries had come out and started talking about fertilizer shortages. Their CEO came on the record and said, we are coming into something that is going to shake the roots of the world. So perhaps we should start talking about this and getting ready for it. But it seemed that it only fell on to agricultural ears. It didn't really make wider news distribution. But then, I keep reading again and again, article after article, poor rail service threatens the U.S. economy. Shippers tell federal regulators, sorry, COVID, we don't have the crews and the teams, and there's no repairs as well. And it just keeps going on and on. So I asked the question here, if we knew the fertilizer shortage was going to be this planting season, and there was going to be gargantuan losses in wheat and corn specifically, could we not have redirected resources and put people to work, sort of a Manhattan Project for agriculture? Is the government so inept and there's nobody working? Is it so unemployed out there that they can't get federal employees that know how to maintenance and service rail lines to get out there to repair broken carriages and cars to put back on the tracks? Do they not have anybody that can run the extra shifts in terms of a national security issue? I mean, not delivering the fertilizer is going to knock down our production so drastically. And this is the thing that nobody wants to talk about. They'll talk about Ukraine all day long. When you're looking at the fertilizer declines, it's generally a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, it's not exactly that in every location, but just as an overall, a 1-to-1 ratio. If you do not apply fertilizer, at the general application. So if you knock 10% and you say, well, we just are missing 10% and you only apply 90% of the normal application on a field, you're going to get a 10% loss because you reduce 10% your application rate on the fertilizer. Now, the same goes with herbicides, which nobody's talking about. It's way tucked away in the back corner, but herbicides are working pretty much about that same 1-to-1 ratio. So if you have an enormous amount of other plants in the fields, they're going to compete with the corn when it emerges. So the kernels aren't going to be enlarged. The stalks aren't going to be as girthy or thick. There's going to be a lot of declines just naturally because the kernel sizes aren't going to be what they normally are because there's all these other plants competing for the same nutrients. And farmers don't want to go out and fertilize a field full of weeds that's going to compete with their corn crop because that's just a waste of money. You just literally blew half of your money as the other plants uptake that fertilizer and it didn't go to your target species. Now, wheat, on the other hand, okay, wheat is grown for, breads and different types of things. And hard red winter wheat is at a 100-year low. And if you hear just the word wheat, I would ask a deeper question, like which type of wheat are we talking about here? Are you talking about spring, soft, white, soft, or hard red winter? What are you talking about with the wheat variety? Because they're used in different ways. So what I've seen so far, and specifically in these articles coming out, is a 20% decline in global wheat availability, meaning not grown because of Russia and Ukraine. Okay, now scrape that off to the left over there. Now let's talk about bigger numbers because they're not adding in the losses from the fertilizer and the herbicides. And here we are just a few days ago, Brazil says they're going to knock application rates 25% downward because they don't have the fertilizer. So I'm scratching my head saying, wait, Brazil just confirmed on the record they're only going to apply 75% of the normal fertilizer that they would put out into the corn and on the coffee. So you can do the numbers. The numbers, like I said, we had before, when CF Industries was talking, they were saying that we were looking for a global fertilizer decline of about 30%. The rails aren't running to get the fertilizer to people, the farmers, the inputs, the diesel's going into shortages and all-time record high prices. The farm machinery has no repair parts coming in because China has completely locked off. And it's this perfect storm of all these factors that are all controlled by corporations, which brings us back to that previous point there, Orve, about, is it a COVID 2.0? Like, how do they get everybody into the digital rationing cards? Well, it only works if corporations are in control of everything and there's no small mom and pop businesses as an alternative to that. And I'm still so baffled how our government has not even put one step forward to alleviate any of these problems to be able to allow us to grow food. These developing nations are going to be crushed. But don't kid yourself. Here in the U.S. and different quote unquote developed nations, the unrest in the city is going to spill out as people are just so angry that they can't afford their food, their electricity to heat their homes, and their gasoline to drive around. It's going to be the trifecta of anger here coming up. And governments are going to respond, how they always do, more control. And that's what it's all about. It's more control, to grab as much control during this natural cycle as possible. They're riding on top of a natural cycle, but blaming it on all these other seeming unrandom events. But they're all definitely connected dot-wise. You can just connect them, put a big board out in front on your wall and start connecting them all together. And you'll see, what's that spelled? WEF up there, maybe?
Yeah. And you touched on me, you're reading my mind. I was also going to ask about diesel, but you also touched on this rationing system. And for the past 2 years, I've been banging on about it, like way back in June. I was in Kazakhstan in 2020, and as soon as everything started, I was planning to go live like on my villa on the Adriatic in Croatia, because I'm also Croatian. And I was in Kazakhstan, and I'm like, no, you know what? We're heading back to Mexico. I'm also a Mexican citizen, and I'm like, we're gonna at least have a bit more freedom a bit longer here in Mexico. And my biggest concern is this digital ID. And way back in June of 2020, I interviewed the Jewish historian Edwin Black, who he calls it the algorithm ghetto, the cashless society, new eugenics, and how basically they'll turn everything off. Like you're talking about the Soviet Union, you won't even need the Gestapo or whoever to knock on your door. They won't knock on your door. They just turn you off digitally. You will literally starve to death in your home. Like I said, I had PayPal switched me off last year. I had Patreon switched me off, and it's like pretty soon, without your functioning digital passport, some people in some houses reportedly couldn't, in some countries during COVID, couldn't leave their homes. I think like in the Philippines, if you were found out on the street and you were unvaccinated, you'd get put in jail or fined or whatever. What's your take on this social credit system? I feel like the walls are closing in. I feel like it's an imminent problem because soon I won't be able to do anything. I'm going to starve to death and my family as well.
It only stops when we say it stops. And that's been like that through history. Every single chapter of history that we've ever been through in the last 5,000 years. It only stops when enough people say it stops. And because that's the pushback that the government's realized that, okay, we can't go that direction. It needs to go a different direction. Because you look at COVID, was it really because, there was more information out there and, they did more studies about mask wearing and they really did more studies about this, that, and the other. And suddenly, boom, the light bulb went off and all the same people that were forcing you under duress are the same ones that go magically on Tuesday, oh, masks, you don't need them anymore. Or was it that there was so much independent media pointing out the hypocrisy and the backward numbers and the studies that said the efficacy and all these things that we could go through for the next 16 hours all didn't make sense. So much independent media actually, I think, turned the tide on that, where the average person started to really understand, whoa, maybe we don't need all this. And it stopped because so many people said, it's time, we need to stop this. And it's going to be like this moving through every single next chapter that's going to unfold in front of us. And, Orve, I traveled in Croatia too, and I love that country. That was one of my favorite countries ever to go through. And, thinking about the COVID thing and places to stay in some safety, I would think that would be one of the countries. And then I was looking at Republic of Georgia as well. But then, every country in lockstep. Doesn't seem to matter where you go. All governments are on board. I was looking at an article, 197 countries are all going to the same direction to control your access to food.